welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cooke. My guest this week is Chris Timmermann. Chris is a neuroscientist based at Imperial College London's Centre for Psychedelic Research. He completed his PhD in the same centre, where he investigated the effects of dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, on the human brain. Today, we talk about how we can take a scientific and a contemplative approach to understanding the DMT experience. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Chris Timmermann. Chris, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, James.
So maybe we can begin with how you came to study psychedelics.
I think there's different sources. One of them has to do with my interest in the mind. And, I studied psychology, but even before then, I was interested in drugs when I was in school, how they worked, and, kind of like a very interesting and unique way to perturb the mind. Since I was little, I was just very intrigued, I guess, an introspective sort of disposition and try to understand, what's going on. And I always thought that drugs were just such a fascinating way to understand that, a perturbational model, if you will. So a way of if you upset the system in some sort of way, in a specific sort of way, then you can get a glimpse of how it's working. So that's kind of like the interest in drugs. And then so that led in a big way for me to study psychology and then eventually neuroscience. So just a strong interest in the mind. So that's kind of like drugs in general. And within that, psychedelics, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that I was, I'm from Chile, and in South America, there is kind of a peculiar relationship with these compounds specifically. There's a cultural sort of background. There's let's say a certain degree of ambience around what these experiences are and what they can show you to a certain extent. And I think that's inevitably linked to, the various indigenous perspectives mixed in with Western sort of education. But then led me to, kind of combine these things into what you might call psychedelic science. And that's how led me to this path, I guess.
And was it the fact that DMT is in ayahuasca, is that what led you to studying DMT in particular?
Not just that. I mean, that was a very important part of it. I guess so. That's a part of it. The fact that there is an intimate relationship with ayahuasca and DMT. Also, the intimate relationship between DMT and snuffs in South America. This also, some evidence says it's over 4,000 years old. So it's super interesting. Even in the desert in the north of Chile, we have amazing repositories of pipes and snuffs and tablets, in which they have found DMT in a stored fashion. So that's one, if you want, the anthropological, cultural sort of lineage, if you will. But the other one is such a fascinating compound when you think about, the extent of the effects that it produces, the immersive quality. And I think overall, this idea that DMT generates worlds of experience, that you can somehow tear down your consensus view of the world, or what you might call normal reality, and then build up a completely novel one that is not just novel one, but it kind of leaves people wondering if that was also real. So it is ontologically shocking, I guess is the term. And within that also this experience of entities and the beings, and, the idea that you can somehow interact with sentient beings. And I think that for me was particularly important. And then the actual nature of that experience, the level of significance that it leaves with people, the impact, I talk about the ontological thing, but also the emotional sort of the way that people engage with it is so fascinating. So it seems to be a drug that has very interesting ripples. And then combined with the idea that, maybe these experiences help maintain or develop certain cosmologies within cultures, it's just fascinating. It's like DMT is a massive storyteller to some extent. So, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Was it a challenge for you to decide to study it kind of scientifically? Because, as you mentioned, you get this kind of ontological shock, and it's, I think, more than any other substance, it seems to really reliably make people question, their understanding of reality. They don't know which way's up, and was there any tension in you when it came to thinking, I'm going to take this thing that produces these crazy experiences, entity encounters, what feels like other worlds, and I'm going to study that in a scientific way?
I guess it was a challenge initially. I mean, I guess when you're faced with in a neuroscience environment, I guess you're always tempted to, achieve reductionistic explanations of phenomena. So you try to boil down everything to brain activity, it's fantastic experience about brain activity. And I think the way that I kind of resolved that was by placing a lot of emphasis on experience and what is the nature of that experience, and putting science on the study of experience. So stemming from the philosophical tradition of phenomenology, essentially using methods to interview people to get a disciplined access to, what are common things happening at the level of experience. And then once we have kind of like some form of grasp around what are these elements of the DMT experience that seems to be common in people, beyond necessarily the flashing lights, but more on like the more profound, constant experience, combining that with brain activity. And that's kind of like the program of neurophenomenology that we're tapping into via psychedelics. That's a big part of like, and I think that for me was a way to resolve that in a way. A way of not leaving experience out of the picture, but also including it in your models, including it in your explanations, and including it in your level of analysis and day-to-day engagement with the actual experiment. So, people had these massive experiences and then they get out, and then we do expensive interviews with them. We go to the bottom of it. So, yeah.
So with the experience itself, you mentioned this kind of phenomenology. Could you explain some of the main themes that people tend to encounter in your studies?
So one of the things that, the typical things that people speak about with DMT is the idea that, you have strong geometrical patterns emerging. People not only seem to be observing these geometrical patterns, but they're immersed in them. So there's this idea that the self-location, that, where people are, the feelings of where am I, like changes in a radical way, right? And this involves maybe changes in vestibular mechanisms, so like equilibrium, stuff like that, balance. All the things that have to do with self-location change in a way that it seems like people are not only looking at this hallucinations, imagery, or whatever you want to call it, but are actually immersed. They have a participatory sort of aspect in that. Another element was this thing that this is usually at the beginning of the experience. Before that, there's a strong sort of element of vibration or rush in the body that a lot of people, I think almost every participant talks about this when they have DMT. So it's almost like you were like a gateway into that experience, that, that there's a feeling of rush in the body, warmth. It usually moves in the body, can be diffused in the body, can be located in different parts of the body. Interestingly enough, and now going more into, comparison with other states of consciousness, but it's very similar to what's reported in what people call sometimes spontaneous Kundalini experiences or awakenings, rushes in the body, or if you read through some of the anthropological literature, even evangelists, when they're reading the Bible and they think that they speak with God, they also sometimes report these rushes in the body. So it's such a fascinating, thing still to tap on, these bodily effects. So that's a big part of it. And people engage with these geometries, and after that, the body kind of like expands or goes away into the background, and people feel that they're now transported into what seems like a different environment that has a feeling of presence or a feeling of reality. People sometimes mention the idea of more real than real. other times people not necessarily attribute that element of reality into that, but certainly emotionally engaging. And that's, what you might say when people are fully immersed in it, so it's almost like it feels like the DMT experience requires that the body goes away to the background or is somehow transformed before people are completely engaged or immersed into what feels like a different dimension, a different reality. And then, you can have various contents, entities are usually talked about because they're very, quite a unique quality of that experience, but that is not necessarily present. Our kind of our calculation is half of the people have that strong feeling of a presence, and that feeling of a presence can come with or without sensory information. People can have a feeling of a presence and they can see an actual being, or they can just feel it somehow. They can feel that the space is alive with sentience or presence. So it can be very varied. And after that, the other thing that we found out is that, this is very short. So it's only in the span of 2 to 5 minutes, maybe even less. And then when people are out of that, they start to come down, the images start to reduce or fade away, and they start to come back to their bodies. There's this kind of second stage of the experience, which we refer to sometimes as an elaboration stage or integration, if you want to do a parallel with psychedelic therapy, in which people are, all these kind of thinking, cognitive, or if you, technically speaking, metacognitive sort of elements start to be engaged again. So the idea that people can actually reflect on their experiences. And usually it's kind of what was this about? How does this connect to my life? Some people having emotional reactions at this point, sometimes crying, sometimes having feelings of gratitude. A lot of people reporting feelings of love and things of the sort. So that's kind of the DMT journey in a nutshell.
Right. And it might be worth saying something about dose, because I feel like what you've described, would you call that a breakthrough experience?
Yes, that's a breakthrough experience. We did a one dose study. We didn't have enough people to properly establish it, but usually when the smaller doses are just feelings in the body, they're pleasant, a bit of geometries. On higher doses, people start breaking through, what you might call the breaking through into this different realm, but it can have sort of a threshold sort of feeling to it. You may be in, you may be out. It's not necessarily as engaging. There's a certain distance with it as an observer. And with the breakthrough doses, the higher doses, the ones that we use mostly in our lab, that's when people report now full immersion. They are there, they are present, they are engaged, they are the geometry. It's not very clear to them what's in and out.
Right. I mean, so in my experience, there feels like there's almost two kinds of breakthrough, where there's, people often talk about some of the phenomenology consisting of waiting rooms or a place before the real, big event. And that's an intermediate stage where you are fully immersed. So I'd be tempted to call that a breakthrough. But then when you read people's trip reports, you realize, well, actually, often the word breakthrough is reserved for this second phase, where it's almost like you enter full immersion, and then there's you're in this kind of waiting room space, fully immersed, and then there's a kind of transition to another space. Did you have this kind of waiting room intermediate phenomenology in your studies?
Yeah, many times. I mean, people sometimes even refer to it as a waiting room, but they're familiarized with the DMT taxonomy, if you will. But yeah, a lot of offices, hospital rooms, and things like this. This is what people report in terms of content.
Right. So yeah, then we've been talking, I guess, about kind of relatively high doses, and at low doses, would you say the effects are similar to other psychedelics?
Some people mention mushrooms and the overall ambience of the experience similar to mushrooms. Then the molecules are very, very similar. Some people call DMT smokable psilocybin even. It could be. I mean, definitely there's this, I think, what is common to all psychedelics is one, the strong sensory engagement that they have. Even if you compare it with ketamine, there is sensory engagement, but it's somehow kind of like more diffuse or less vivid in terms of the imagery. The geometrical patterns are very similar, especially at low doses. And overall, I think the way that the thinking changes, the idea that things get more meaningful, dot connection is enhanced at the level of ideas, the possibility of gaining some form of insights, regarding your own life or regarding the external world. These things happen in all doses, but also in low doses, which might be more similar to LSD even.
Right. Yeah, I think, and as the dose increases, the phenomenon you described of the rush, this like bodily, feeling of kind of acceleration is really, for anyone who's not tried it, I think this is one of the things that could be hard to imagine almost, because, most people might imagine that you could sit there and view the experience, that you could feel somewhat grounded and just see this, and they might not understand why it's so intense. But it seems to me it comes with this first there's this kind of increasing feeling of acceleration, which is quite, I find it not, that easy to make sense of. Maybe it is, as you say, it's just a scrambling of like vestibular signals and all these other bodily signals. It might just be that, perception is inherently embodied and about our location in space. And when you start to mess with it in this immersive way, perhaps, it's like having the rug pulled out from under our feet, ability to really know where we are. And so it increases some just general level of activation. Do you have a sense of where that's coming from, that sense of rush?
Oh, that's one of the big questions. Yeah, I don't know. I think, it's really a fascinating. Also, that's why I mentioned the other states of consciousness that appear to be linked to this rush or this bodily feeling. And it's really hard. I mean, I think some people call it the vibrational state. I'm not quite aware of it because a lot linked with out-of-body experiences, spontaneous ones. So, but I'm not very much aware of that sort of like what they speak about that. But so I don't know. When I sometimes dabble in speculation, my feeling is that, a lot of reports coming out of the DMT experience is like, I reconnected with, my body. Sometimes people even speak about like my cells, my cells, my molecules were becoming alive. And there's almost a feeling in which, the idea, I mean, about predictive processing, but I guess I'll explain it in lay terms. The idea that we construct the world, and that, our perception is now driven by this construction, by these models that we have of the world, and we're not aware of it. So it's a transparent mechanism. It's just, the models rule the thing. When you have an experience like this, you break down that to such an extent that you go to perception is now driven, as you say, from lower levels, from the actual body, from what you might call interoception. And my feeling is that somehow this deconstruction makes the body come alive, if you know what I mean.
Right. Yeah.
And this kind of like makes all our bodily signals to be hypersalient. But I think that may be that's the theory. That's my hypothesis. Like I'm not sure, but I also find that this is, you can test this with neurophenomenology. It's one of the things that we're trying to do. And the other thing is that I find it like a really exciting thing, the fact that you can tap into your body from a more naive perspective. It's almost like there's a bit of an ontological implication in that you can have more direct perception of the basic grounds of biology to a certain extent by getting away from stories. So yeah, for me, like DMT may be an interesting way to tap into the continuity between mind and life, from a more philosophical perspective. Life being biology, mind being like the conscious mind. So yeah, that would be my feeling of what's kind of going on. It's highly speculative, but I think it's kind of like an engaging opportunity.
That's really interesting. I'm very intrigued by that because to me a lot of the phenomenology, I mean, it can seem extremely sci-fi and strange, but aspects of it feel almost like, as you mentioned, there's like three-dimensional spaces like rooms, but a lot of it could almost feel like what it would be like to be a replicating single cell or a simple life form, just kind of navigating through spaces. And could you say a bit more about why you think there's a link there? Because I find that very plausible and exciting that there could be a link between that DMT could be a way to explore the link between mind and life. Like, do you think maybe it has a role in like fundamental physiology in some way?
Well, I don't know if like a fundamental role in physiology, like endogenous DMT. I'm not an expert in endogenous DMT, and there's so much noise there that I'd rather maybe not go there. But I can talk about it, of course. But I guess for me, it's the idea that people come out of the feeling with a lot of. I mean, there's a lot of phenomena in the world which, like around psychedelic experiences, we still haven't explained, and I think they can be subsumed under this idea. One is that the experience feels organic to many people. Like there's a feeling of organicity to it. The other element is, and that's very diffuse to say, because reports can be not clean. The way people refer to the experience can be influenced a lot by our cultural stories, and that can say, oh, it's organic, so it's not necessarily a very good argument, but it is one. The other one is that people report strong feelings of nature connectedness under psychedelics, and this is a huge question. Like, we don't have a good answer for that. Like, why do people connect more with nature under psychedelics? There's a lot around the idea that how we, the idea of narrow focus perception versus open perception are the way that we constrain focus and the way that we open focus when we're in nature, the way that nature engages our sensory systems in a very diffused, open monitoring sort of way almost. And this is, kind of well known in the mindfulness literature to some extent, like a similar way of perceiving. So the idea that in psychedelic states, we also engage very similar sort of attentional mechanisms in which this chaotic activity is now drawing our attention in a more equanimous sort of fashion. So that's, I think it's an interesting link. We don't know why people connect with nature, but people do appear to connect with nature, even when they're not in natural environments. And then a third one, a really exciting one, is that, where are the geometries coming from? Everyone gets these geometrical patterns. There's some exciting sort of computational modeling work suggesting that these geometries that you're seeing are actual manifestations of the visual cortex of V1. It's almost like you're perceiving, a more fundamental biological mechanism on the flesh. So I think these kind of things for me are part of the idea of why psychedelics are possibly allowing us to modulate our awareness within that mind and life continuum. At the other end, when you enhance meaning making and you can develop new stories, or you're moving more towards the mind aspect of the continuum, but the idea that you can modulate it and that you can become aware of that modulation, either via research or via advanced psychonautics or via, disciplined psychonautics, somehow brings forth the possibility of an awareness of these processes.
Right. Yeah, I think the thing you said as well about when you get away from living in a kind of mode of seeing the world through stories, to me, I completely agree. I think psychedelics move us in a direction where, well, in the Western tradition, a lot of people kind of, modern neuroscience have taken the kind of view that perhaps consciousness is something to do with being very advanced kind of intellectually as these, species with a big cortex. And it's something to do with our kind of rationality and some kind of computer processing power. Whereas to me, it feels more like it's actually something very, as you say, linked to life, very fundamental. It's more about feeling your way in the world. So on a psychedelic, if you take down the kind of the rational mind aspect that's kind of building up abstractions and stories, and consciousness is still there, you're still aware, you can have a feeling, I think a lot of people anecdotally report with things like psilocybin feeling as if they see the world how a plant might see the world, or a very simple organism where they're just kind of awake and there's no kind of inner dialogue, there's no thinking as such, but you're still wide awake and you're still feeling your way through the world. So in that sense, all psychedelics, I think have this kind of organismic feeling. It puts you in touch with that level of what you are. I think that's I think it's a really promising area to go down. And the idea that so you mentioned the idea that with the geometry that perhaps you're seeing the kind of almost the programming of your visual apparatus. To me, that makes a lot of sense. When you think of the deep familiarity people have with these states, they feel as if there's a deep recognition they've been here before. And if what they're experiencing is a kind of projection of their basic programming, you would expect there to be some recognition there. As I go about the world seeing faces, I'm actually kind of comparing them to some kind of average face that I have stored in my brain. And even though I may never see that average face, if you showed it to me, I would have a deep recognition of like, this is the thing that I've been looking for like prototypical faceness. So when people, as these social primates, I think if we're engaging with entities and it feels very familiar and it has this very simple geometry, to me, it seems like we could be encountering our base programming in some sense. Do you think that seems plausible?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting possibility. I think it's plausible. And at the same time, I mean, for me, it's like, it has intimate, like the possibility of whether or not it's plausible is intimately related of how we engage with the experience and our craftsmanship of how we engage with the experience. So we tap into the idea of like know-how. And for me, and why do I mention this? Because at the same time, it's not a given that you might have this more, if you will, contemplative possibility around engaging with the mind via the psychedelic experience, and therefore understanding basic mechanisms. But as I said, you could also go into the development of stories in that psychedelic experience and develop stronger forms of grasping around that. So the idea is that you engage with the stories and you get stuck in them. A good example is, challenging experiences with psychedelics in which paranoia sets in. And almost like, it's really hard to speak about the same as psychosis, but some people do mention that they can be the challenging episodes that have that sort of quality of delusion sometimes, in which it seems like a story is being developed, like my neighbor wants to kill me, and it becomes fixed. And that challenging story now becomes like an abstraction of what we're speaking about. And it almost seems like instead of like the constructive aspect of the experience is enhanced, it's more like this constructive of the experience becomes enhanced. And that has, as far as, psychedelic practice relates, it's like completely related to set and setting, whether or not these experiences will have that sort of quality, or they will have this deconstructive quality. So the idea is that my position is that, the more we engage with this experience from a skillful know-how sort of perspective, in which we are able to develop and train those abilities that enable us this understanding or deconstruction of certain mental structures, the more we can, access that sort of learning or knowledge throughout the experience, or we can have maybe access to what the things that you were mentioning, which is like a direct perception of this mechanism related to perception, for example.
Right. And you mentioned this idea that with psychedelics, usually we talk about them kind of deconstructing our perception But as you say, if you're fearful, you can be put into a state of kind of overconstruction of paranoid, delusional thinking. When I think about how rich in content the DMT experience is, and I think about how it kind of parallels, you mentioned it being kind of similar in some ways to psilocybin. As you go up in dose of psilocybin, you get a lot of deconstruction until you get to a kind of mystical experience state. Then if you go higher, people tend to have these DMT type experiences with entities and a lot of content. And the main way I guess I try and think about that is that perhaps, if you're pushing the brain into a state of maximum kind of openness and not holding on to its models, perhaps there's like a rebound effect with dose, where if you go up, if you keep increasing the dose, or if DMT is considered like a kind of a stronger version of psilocybin, perhaps the system doesn't just kind of give up and go into a whiteout. It actually kind of starts to project very intense, very convincing, very real experience, which also might account for why the DMT experience feels so real. How do you think about this kind of relationship between the amount of content, the huge amount of content and construction that goes on in the DMT experience and the deconstructing aspects of psychedelics?
Yeah, I think it's super complex in the sense that, on one hand, it seems that it enhances the constructive thing, as you say, and at the same time, the holding on to that, like, oh my God, it's real. But at the same time, it has a dynamic element to it. So when you put time into that equation, like people get into strong, oh my God, it's real, you hold on, but then it's like destructed, and then another thing is brought up, and no, that was real. Oh, that was a trickstery thing happening, the cosmic game, and then massive deconstruction immediately. So when that is put into the equation, it's almost like, yeah, it just becomes more complex in a way. The relationship between these things. It certainly seems as if, the other day I heard I have a friend, she's a meditation researcher, and we were speaking about, like, how do we think about the continuum between de-reification or deconstruction and construction in the meditation and psychedelic states. And she says something about in meditation, in contemplative tradition, sometimes the teacher needs, it's all about building worlds, building realities, so that then they become deconstructed. And it's almost like the dynamic of it, enables you to then reach a maximum level of deconstruction. So you have stories of constructions within a larger story of deconstruction. And maybe, that similar sort of thing happens with the higher doses of DMT or even other psychedelics, in a way that you do need to have that level of strong construction to allow a larger narrative of deconstruction to emerge.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. No, and I love this approach, this kind of contemplative approach to thinking about the DMT experience, because the sense of reality is so strong. But then, if you practice something like meditation, you can see that our sense of reality is incredibly strong for our everyday experience, and it's possible to see through, certain meditation practices where you see, if you're bothered by a certain feeling in the body, you can experiment with different ways of looking at it, and then be left with a feeling of it's what Buddhists would call emptiness. That it actually doesn't have that intrinsic character inside it. It's not some solid permanent thing out there in the world. It's actually just a way of, it just seems that way. And that's very liberating and allows you to kind of see through, leads to, kind of liberation from suffering. And I can imagine that being, a very useful practice with the DMT experience, and a framework of thinking about this, because as you say, it feels so real. And when we understand and we're familiar with the fact that our minds are capable of reifying through kind of grasping onto things and projecting this sense of reality, I can imagine that being really helpful. And it might be worth just kind of outlining, we're both coming at this from a relatively mainstream, I would say, picture of what consciousness is, which is that you have stuff out there in the world of kind of physics, but it doesn't really look any particular way. This is what Kant would call like the noumenon. And then consciousness is almost like a user interface for the organism, a red rose doesn't objectively look like that. It looks different to a pollinating insect, and it has no objective appearance. Appearance is just our kind of interface. But it doesn't feel that way. As you say, it's transparent. So it wouldn't be useful if when we saw a red rose, we thought, oh, well, this is just an apparition in my mind. It's very ephemeral and it's not actually a rose. Instead, we have this feeling of, no, it's out there. It exists. I can grab it. It helps us actually engage with it. But then if you meditate or you take a psychedelic and suddenly the rose starts kind of dissolving, say, you can suddenly realize, oh, okay, this is all phenomena. This is all mental stuff, right? It helps me navigate the world. There is still a physical thing out there, but it doesn't look the way we think it does. And then, so I would say this is kind of framework where you can start to think about, well, what's my mind, what models of the world is my mind generating, and how much is it projecting kind of solidity into those kind of attributions of things out there in the world. Do you think, is that the kind of framework you're coming from as well?
Yeah, very much. I mean, I think ultimately one of the, I don't know if the most, because I really don't want to reduce it just to our consciousness sort of framework. I think that they're so broad as a thing in the world, psychedelics, that low consciousness is a very central aspect, at least in the way that I see the world. I think that one of the most valuable things that they teach us is precisely about the idea of what we're saying now, transparency and opacification. The idea that you're able to now proceed via perturbation. You now see structures that you wouldn't have seen otherwise, or you realize that there may be structures in place where you thought that that there were no structures in place. So yeah, very, very much agreeing with that. In a way, it's almost like, from a very basic perspective, I think they promote what you might call a phenomenological attitude, an attitude in which you suspend your naive realism, as you say, and there's a parenthesis being developed. The way that I go in the world and taking for grantedness of things, is just inherently suspended. And questioning starts, and the possibility of engaging with your own experience is different, and maybe the possibility of looking at your own experience now becomes more salient and more possible. And I also think this is possibly, I hope it is, one of the principles of psychedelic therapy as well. So the idea is that, you suspend your naive assumptions about yourself and of the world, and by introducing this parenthesis and experience this disruption, you're able to reevaluate, renegotiate your relationship with these things. And as a friend recently mentioned, it gives you more degrees of freedom to engage with the world. And maybe this is linked with the reduction of suffering in psychedelic therapy and so on.
Right. Yeah, I think it's important as well, to reflect on how one stays grounded, or how one approaches these experiences, because, as you say, it's very common for people to have this ontological shock where they go from thinking this naive realism where you think your perception of the world is just the way the world is. You go, this is the world, and then you have this experience that feels more real, and then you go, well, either you would say, well, I guess that's the real world, that's where I go when I die, and this is secondary in some way, or it's, people can come up with any number of new kind of pictures of reality right after the DMT experience, and it can be hard for people to know which way is up. It can be hard for them to justify this to themselves just from from that one experience. That how can I claim that this is the real world when that one felt more real? Kind of like if you'd had a dream for the first time, and it felt completely real and immersive, you could get a bit confused as to what was the real reality. And what I like about this approach of kind of approaching it in this kind of phenomenological, contemplative way is it's not dogmatic. It's not saying, look, we're the scientists with the textbooks, you have to agree with us just, because we say so, we have the authority. But it reminds me very much of my own experience with DMT, where the first time I tried it, it's really the only thing in my life that's given me pause when it came to having a scientific worldview. The first experience I was, for a second, I was like, wait a minute, all these cultures have been talking about spirits for all time. Is it possible that us scientists over the last few hundred years have just by saying that's not in science, we're just going to look over here, have we been ignoring, all this stuff? But then it was only through re-engaging, in the same way that if you had a dream for the first time, you could be forgiven for thinking like, well, there's some other reality going on. But then you go to bed every night, you have more dreams. You start to notice the way your daily experience feeds into the dreams. You notice how it doesn't add up as like as a freestanding autonomous reality. And then you come to discover for yourself that it isn't what it initially seemed, which is another way of describing kind of contemplative practice. So to me, I think this is a useful approach for people to not get lost in this stuff and not get kind of confused and overwhelmed, because it doesn't rely just on kind of experts, but of people figuring out for themselves. Do you think this is do you think this can have the effect of people kind of feeling more grounded and not being lost in this kind of confusion with the DMT experience?
Well, I think so, yeah. I mean, and not just the DMT experience. I think psychedelics in general. I think I'm kind of like, that's where my money's at in terms of where should we go with this, especially when we think about the massification of it and the mainstream, and psychedelics are still operating on a sort of bubble. It's expanding, but it's still a bubble of people who are well equipped to engage with this. When I think about the mainstreaming of it, and like, there is a bit of a, whoa, that's a lot of people tripping, and these are not trivial experiences. So a big part of it is, if we have a framework in which we can support a process that has that sort of container, in which essentially you need to somehow acknowledge that there is no ultimate ground, and you kind of like skillfully try to develop a way to hold things lightly, as opposed to grasp onto these teachings or these things that the substance tells you or the experience tells you in a very strong way. It seems to be that it has better, it's kind of like the slow game, but with better sort of possibilities on the long run. That's where my money's at, I would say. So I'm very interested in seeing how can we understand from consciousness research, the overlaps between contemplative practices and psychedelic practices, but also their synergies, and also finally from a clinical perspective, how can we support the psychedelic process with contemplative practices.
Right. Oh, this has been really fun. Thanks for your time, Chris.
Oh, thank you, James. Very engaging. Yeah.
Yeah. Where would you send people to if they want to look into your work more? Do you have a website or anything?
So I got some papers. So there's my Twitter feed. You can find me on Twitter. The Instagram is kind of messy. We're developing certain things, but yeah, I guess the Twitter feed is by far the best place to get updates and things of the sort. And then the Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London, where we do a lot of work. You can also look for that and keep in touch with that.
Right. Yeah, and we didn't even get to talk about any of your actual research, so maybe we'll have to do this again in future.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. Happy to do it again. Thank you very much, James.
Thanks, Chris.